If you'd asked me a year ago how my marriage was going, I'd have told you it was good. Maybe not perfect, but solid. Sarah and I had been married for 6 years, and we'd always made a good team, or so I thought. I was working 2 jobs back then. My main job was at a construction supply company, 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. Then, in the evenings, I worked as a delivery driver for a courier service. That extra income was helping us save for a house, maybe even a vacation. Sarah and I had talked about taking a trip to Italy someday, and I was determined to make it happen. She wasn't working at the time. A few months earlier, she'd been laid off from her job at a boutique clothing store. It wasn't her fault, the store closed down, but it hit her hard. She said she wanted to take some time to figure out what she wanted to do next, and I supported her decision. I told her I'd handle the finances for now. Not long after, Sarah told me her mom wasn't doing well. Her mom, Carol, was in her late 60s and had always been frail, but apparently, her health had taken a turn for the worse. Sarah started visiting her regularly, sometimes staying overnight to help her out. "I just don't want her to feel alone," Sarah said one night while we were eating dinner. "I get it," I told her. "Family comes first. Let me know if she needs anything. I can help cover her expenses." "Thanks, babe," she said with a smile. "You're the best." I meant what I said. Carol had always been kind to me, and I didn't want her to struggle. If Sarah needed to spend more time with her mom, I was okay with it. I figured that was what being a husband meant. Supporting your wife, even when it wasn't convenient. At first, everything seemed normal. Sarah would leave in the morning, drive over to her mom's house, and come home in the evening. Sometimes, she'd call me during the day to let me know she'd be staying overnight. She always had a reason. Her mom was having trouble sleeping, or she needed help organizing her medications. I didn't think twice about it. I was working long hours, exhausted most of the time, and just grateful that Sarah was doing something meaningful. But then, little things started to stand out. It started with her appearance. Sarah was always naturally beautiful, but she'd never been one to wear a lot of makeup or spend hours getting ready unless we had plans. Now, she was putting in effort every time she left the house. Curling her hair, doing her makeup, and wearing outfits that looked more suited for a night out than a trip to her mom's. One morning, as she was putting on lipstick in the mirror, I joked, "Carol must be feeling pretty special with you looking like that." She laughed and said, "Oh, stop. I just want to look nice. It makes me feel good about myself." It seemed harmless at the time, but looking back, it was the first crack in the foundation of our marriage. The second crack was her phone. Sarah had never been secretive about her phone before. She used to leave it lying around the house, and if she got a text or call, she'd answer it without a second thought. But now, she kept it with her constantly, like it was glued to her hand. If her phone buzzed while we were watching TV, she'd glance at it and quickly swipe the notification away. Sometimes, she'd leave the room to take a call, saying, "It's just my mom." I didn't want to be that guy, the jealous, suspicious husband. I told myself there was a perfectly reasonable explanation for all of it. Maybe she was just stressed. Maybe she needed space. But the doubt was there, gnawing at the edges of my mind. One night, I came home earlier than usual from my delivery shift. Sarah didn't hear me come in because she was in the bedroom, talking on the phone. Her voice was soft, almost like she didn't want to be overheard. I stood in the hallway, straining to catch what she was saying. "Can't wait to see you again," she whispered. My heart stopped. I stepped into the bedroom, and she froze, the phone still pressed to her ear. When she saw me, her eyes widened, and she quickly ended the call. "You're home early," she said, forcing a smile. "Yeah," I replied, trying to keep my voice even. "Slow night." "Who were you talking to?" I asked casually, pretending not to notice how tense she looked. "Oh, just my mom," she said, waving it off. She was having trouble with the TV remote again. I didn't say anything else, but that night I barely slept. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was tired and overthinking it. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That phone call kept replaying in my head, her soft tone, the quick way she ended it when I walked in, and her excuse about her mom struggling with the TV. It didn't add up, but I didn't want to believe it. For the next few days, I tried to push the doubts out of my mind. I told myself I was just being paranoid. Sarah had never given me a reason to doubt her before, so why now? Maybe I was just stressed from working so much, reading too much into things. But the cracks were starting to show. It was little things at first. Sarah's routine didn't change, but I started paying closer attention to her behavior. She'd leave the house around 10 in the morning, dressed like she was headed to brunch or a date, not her mom's house. She'd always carry that same reusable tote bag with her, saying it was for groceries or things her mom needed. One night, as she was packing the bag, I noticed something odd. There was no food or cleaning supplies, just a change of clothes, some toiletries, and a small makeup bag. "What's all that for?" I asked casually. She looked up, startled, then quickly said, "Oh, I just like to freshen up while I'm there. You know, Mom keeps the house so warm, and I end up feeling gross by the end of the day." It was a decent excuse, but it still felt off. Then there was her phone. It wasn't just the way she kept it close. It was how secretive she'd become about it. If I glanced in her direction when she was texting, she'd tilt the screen away. Sometimes, she'd step outside to make a call, saying it was easier to hear without the TV on. One night, while we were sitting on the couch watching TV, her phone buzzed on the coffee table. She glanced at the screen, then quickly grabbed it and locked it before I could see anything. "Who's that?" I asked, keeping my tone light. "Just a friend from the boutique," she said without looking up. "She's been thinking about starting a new business and wanted my advice." Again, it sounded reasonable enough, but the way she said it, hurried, almost defensive, didn't sit right with me. The breaking point came one Saturday morning. I'd planned to sleep in after a long week, but I woke up to the sound of Sarah getting ready. She was in the bathroom, doing her hair and makeup, humming softly to herself. When she came out, she was wearing a sundress I hadn't seen in years, one that hugged her figure perfectly. "You're heading to your mom's dressed like that?" I asked, half joking. She rolled her eyes. "Oh, stop. It's just a dress." "You look great," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. "But don't you think it's a little much for sitting around with your mom?" She laughed. "She likes it when I dress up. It makes her happy." That answer didn't sit right with me either. After she left, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my coffee and trying to make sense of everything. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to trust that everything she was saying was true. But the pieces weren't fitting together. Her mom wasn't the type to care about appearances. She was a sweet, simple woman who wore slippers and cardigans around the house and never gave a damn about fashion. It didn't make sense for Sarah to be dressing up like that just to see her. And then there was the money. I'd been giving Sarah cash here and there to help with her mom's expenses. Groceries, medications, even gas money for the trips back and forth. But when I looked at our bank account, I started noticing charges I couldn't explain. High-end restaurants, spa visits, boutique stores. Things that didn't match the modest lifestyle Sarah had always claimed she was living. I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe she treated her mom to a nice meal or bought her something special. But the doubt was growing. That evening, when Sarah got home, I asked her how her mom was doing. "She's okay," she said, setting her tote bag down on the counter. "We went through some old photo albums today. She loved it." It sounded like the perfect response. Sweet, caring, exactly what I'd expect from Sarah. But then I glanced at her bag. Sticking out of the top was a receipt from a restaurant. Curious, I waited until she left the room, then pulled it out. It was from a trendy place downtown, a spot we'd gone to once for an anniversary dinner. The receipt wasn't for takeout, though. It was for 2 full meals, along with a bottle of wine. I stared at it, my stomach churning. Who was she having dinner with? That night, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided I needed answers. The next time Sarah said she was going to her mom's, I was going to follow her. When Sarah told me she was heading to her mom's house the next morning, I pretended like everything was normal. "Need me to give you some extra cash for groceries?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. "That'd be great," she said with a smile. leaning over to kiss me on the cheek. "You're the best." I handed her a couple of bills, watching as she tucked them into her wallet and grabbed her tote bag. She looked good, too good. She was wearing a fitted blouse, dark jeans that showed off her figure, and those little ankle boots she always saved for special occasions. "Tell your mom I said hi," I said as she walked out the door. "Will do," she replied cheerfully, and then she was gone. The moment her car disappeared down the street, I grabbed my keys and headed to my truck. This time I wasn't going to lose her. I waited about 10 minutes before leaving, just to make sure I didn't pull out right behind her. My hands were shaking as I drove, a mix of nerves and adrenaline coursing through me. When I hit the main road, I caught sight of her car a few blocks ahead. I kept a safe distance, making sure not to get too close. She drove toward her mom's neighborhood, and for a moment, I thought maybe I was wrong. Maybe she really was going to see her mom, and I was just being paranoid. But then, right before the turn to her mom's street, she kept driving. I stayed behind her, watching as she took a different route, one that led out of the residential area and onto a busier road. My heart sank. She eventually pulled into a parking lot near a small cafe I'd never been to. I parked a little farther down the street, keeping her car in sight. Sarah got out, smoothing her blouse and fixing her hair in the reflection of her car window. She looked nervous, glancing around like she was waiting for someone. And then he showed up. A tall, muscular guy in a fitted t-shirt and jeans walked up to her. He had that gym rat look, broad shoulders, defined arms, and a cocky grin plastered on his face. Sarah's whole demeanor changed when she saw him. Her face lit up, and she gave him a hug that was a little too friendly. They walked into the cafe together, laughing like they didn't have a care in the world. I stayed in my truck, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. My stomach churned as I watched them through the cafe window. They were sitting across from each other, leaning in close, smiling, and talking like they were in their own little bubble. This wasn't just lunch. This wasn't her helping her mom. This was an affair. But I wasn't ready to confront her. Not yet. I wanted more proof, something concrete I could use when the time came. After about an hour, they left the cafe together. I snapped a few photos from my truck, my hands shaking as I zoomed in on Sarah laughing at something he said. She got back into her car and drove off, and for a moment, I debated following her again. But I was too rattled, too angry to think straight. Instead, I drove home, my mind racing. That evening, Sarah came home like nothing had happened. She greeted me with a smile, set her tote bag down, and started talking about her mom. "Mom's doing okay," she said, pulling out a container of leftovers. "She made way too much pasta, so I brought some home for us." She even had the nerve to say, "She asked about you today. Said she missed seeing you." I just nodded, forcing a smile, but inside, I was boiling. The lies were piling up, and now I had proof. But I knew I had to be smart about this. If I confronted her too soon, she'd find a way to twist the situation or deny everything. I needed more. The next morning, I drove to her mom's house. Carol greeted me at the door, surprised to see me but as sweet as ever. "Hi, dear. What a nice surprise," she said. "Sarah didn't tell me you were coming by." I hesitated. "She's not here." "No, I haven't seen her in a few days," Carol said, looking puzzled. "Why? Did she say she was coming over?" I forced a smile. "Oh no, I must have misunderstood. How are you doing?" We chatted for a little while and I did my best to act normal. But the whole time my mind was racing. She hadn't been there in days. Everything she'd been telling me was a lie. As I drove home, I felt a strange mix of anger and sadness. This was it. I couldn't keep ignoring the signs or giving her the benefit of the doubt. She wasn't who I thought she was, and I needed to confront her. But first I had to be sure. The next time she left, I was going to follow her again, this time all the way to wherever she was really going. By the time Sarah left the house again a few days later, I was ready. My doubts had grown into certainty, and I knew I couldn't sit by and let her lies continue. That morning, she came down the stairs in another carefully chosen outfit, a flowy sundress and wedge sandals. She looked stunning, like she was heading to a brunch or a date. Not to her mom's. You're going to see your mom, right? I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. Yeah, she said, not even looking at me as she poured herself a cup of coffee. She asked me to come help her reorganize the guest room. She's been feeling better lately, but she's still a little slow getting around. Tell her I said hi, I said, watching her closely. She smiled, kissed me on the cheek, and walked out the door. As soon as her car pulled away, I grabbed my keys, threw on a baseball cap, and followed her. This time I was careful. I waited a few minutes before pulling out of the driveway, keeping enough distance between our cars that she wouldn't notice me. I stayed far back, watching as she took the same route toward her mom's neighborhood. But just like before, she drove right past her mom's street and kept going. My chest tightened as I followed her onto a highway that led to the outskirts of town. The area was quieter, lined with trees and large, sprawling properties. After about 20 minutes, she turned into the driveway of a house I'd never seen before. It was big, 2 stories with a wraparound porch and a beautifully landscaped yard. I parked a few blocks away and waited. My heart was pounding as I watched her get out of the car, smoothing her dress and running her fingers through her hair. She walked up to the front door, and a moment later, it opened. There he was, the same guy from the cafe, the muscular, cocky-looking man I'd seen her with before. He was wearing swim trunks and a tank top, and he greeted her with a wide grin. She stepped inside, and the door closed behind her. I sat there in my car, gripping the steering wheel and trying to process what I'd just seen. I could have left right then. I could have driven home, called my lawyer, and started the process of ending our marriage. But I needed more. I needed to know exactly what was going on. After waiting for a few minutes, I got out of my car and walked toward the house. I stayed behind the trees that lined the property, moving quietly until I reached the backyard. That's when I saw them. Sarah was lying on a lounge chair by the pool, her sundress draped over the back of the chair. She was wearing a bikini I didn't even know she owned. The guy was sitting next to her, leaning in close as they laughed and talked. A bottle of champagne sat on a small table between them. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures. Every click of the camera felt like a nail in the coffin of our marriage. Sarah, laughing and leaning toward him. Sarah, sipping champagne. Sarah, letting him rub sunscreen on her shoulders. I wanted to scream, to march up to her and demand an explanation. But I stayed hidden, knowing that confrontation could wait. After about an hour, they both got up and headed inside the house. I didn't follow them, I didn't need to. I had all the proof I needed. That night, when Sarah came home, she acted like nothing was wrong. She greeted me with a smile, set her bag down on the counter, and started talking about her mom. "She's doing so much better," she said, pulling out a container of leftovers. "She made lasagna today and insisted I bring some home for you." I stared at her, barely able to keep the rage out of my voice. "That's nice of her," I said. "Yeah," Sarah said, oblivious to the tension in the room. "She even said she'd like to have us over for dinner soon." I nodded, biting my tongue. I wasn't ready to confront her yet. Not until I had my lawyer lined up and a solid plan in place. But as she stood there, smiling and lying to my face, I knew one thing for sure. Our marriage was over. Over the next few days, I put all my energy into building a case against Sarah. I wasn't going to let her walk away from this unscathed, not after everything she'd done. First, I backed up all the photos I'd taken of her with that guy, the poolside lounging, the champagne, the sunscreen. Every single image went into a secure folder on my computer. I also saved screenshots of the suspicious bank transactions and wrote down every instance I could remember of her lying about where she'd been. But I needed more than just photos and vague recollections. I started by checking our joint bank account again. The deeper I dug, the angrier I got. Sarah had been spending my hard-earned money on spa visits, fancy dinners, and even hotel stays. There was a charge for a luxury lingerie store, a place she hadn't shopped at since we first got married. It was clear that every dime I'd been working 2 jobs to save had been funding her little double life. I printed out the transaction history, highlighting every questionable expense. By the time I was done, I had a stack of evidence that painted a pretty damning picture. The next step was Sarah's phone. One evening, when she was in the shower, I unlocked it using the passcode I'd memorized weeks ago. My hands were shaking as I opened her messages. There it was, a string of texts from a number labeled Jake. The messages were exactly what I'd feared. Jake, can't wait to see you again. Sarah, me too. I loved last night. Jake, you look so sexy. That dress was amazing. Sarah, you bring out the best in me, winking face. I felt sick reading the words. She wasn't just cheating on me. She was invested in this guy, emotionally and physically. Scrolling further, I found photos she'd sent him. A few innocent ones, her smiling in the car, posing by a fountain. But then, there were others, intimate ones. I took screenshots of everything and sent them to myself, making sure to delete any trace of my actions from her phone. The final piece of the puzzle came when I decided to track her movements. I'd installed a GPS tracking app on her phone weeks earlier, right after the first time I followed her. It was a last resort, something I'd hoped I wouldn't have to use. But now I was glad I had it. When she left the house claiming to visit her mom, I tracked her route in real time. Sure enough, she went straight back to the same house I'd seen her at before. This time, she stayed there for hours. I took all the evidence I'd gathered to my lawyer. The photos, the texts, the financial records, and the GPS logs. My lawyer was blunt but reassuring. "This is solid," he said, flipping through the stack of papers. "With this much evidence, you're in a strong position. We'll make sure she doesn't walk away with a penny more than she deserves." We discussed the next steps. Filing for divorce, freezing our joint accounts, and protecting my assets. My lawyer explained that infidelity wouldn't necessarily guarantee a financial win, but with the financial mismanagement and proof of her deceit, I had a good case. By the time I left his office, I felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was regaining control of my life. At home, Sarah was as cheerful and oblivious as ever. She sat on the couch scrolling through her phone, probably texting Jake. I watched her for a moment, wondering how she could sit there so calmly while lying to my face every day. "Everything okay?" she asked, glancing up at me. "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "Just a long day." It took everything in me not to confront her right then and there. But I knew the timing had to be perfect. I wanted everything in place before I pulled the rug out from under her. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I made a promise to myself. This ends now. By the time I was ready to confront Sarah, I felt more numb than angry. The heartbreak and fury I'd felt when I first pieced everything together had been replaced by a cold determination. This wasn't just about ending our marriage. It was about making sure she faced the consequences of her actions. I had everything I needed: the photos, the messages, the bank records. My lawyer was in the process of drafting the divorce papers, and I'd already moved most of our shared savings into a separate account. There was nothing left to do but face her. It was a Friday evening when I decided to pull the trigger. Sarah had just come home from visiting her mom. She breezed through the door with her usual bright smile, carrying that same tote bag she always brought with her. "Hey, babe," she said, setting the bag on the counter. "I'm starving. Should we order takeout tonight?" "Sure," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "Why don't you sit down for a minute first? I need to talk to you about something." Her smile faltered slightly, but she sat on the couch and crossed her legs, her expression curious. "What's up?" she asked. I walked over to the coffee table and set down a folder, the same folder I'd taken to my lawyer. "I need you to explain this," I said, sliding it toward her. She frowned, reaching for the folder, and opened it. The first thing she saw was a photo of her and Jake by the pool, champagne glasses in hand. Her face went pale. What is this?" she stammered, flipping through the other photos, the texts, the receipts, the screenshots of her location history. "You tell me," I said, crossing my arms. For a moment, she just stared at the papers, her mouth opening and closing like she couldn't find the words. Then she looked up at me, tears welling in her eyes. "I can explain," she said weakly. "Go ahead." I said, my voice flat. I'd love to hear it. First, she tried to deny it. It's not what it looks like, she said, her voice shaking. Jake is just a friend. He was helping me with some things. Helping you? I scoffed. You mean like rubbing sunscreen on you by the pool? Or spending my money on dinners and hotels? Is that the kind of help you're talking about? Her face crumpled, and she started to cry. I didn't mean for it to happen, she said, her voice cracking. I was lonely, okay? You're always working, and I felt like you didn't even see me anymore. I stared at her, my jaw tightening. So your solution was to lie to me, to cheat on me, and to use my hard-earned money to fund your little affair? Do you even hear how ridiculous you sound? She reached for my hand, but I pulled away. Please, she begged. I made a mistake, but we can fix this. I'll end things with Jake, I promise. We can go to counseling, work through this. No, I said, cutting her off. We're done, Sarah. There's nothing to fix. Her tears turned into anger. So that's it, she snapped. You're just going to throw away 6 years of marriage like it's nothing? I laughed bitterly. I'm throwing it away? You're the one who threw it away the moment you started sneaking around behind my back. Don't you dare try to pin this on me. She opened her mouth to argue, but I wasn't done. I've already spoken to a lawyer, I said, watching her expression shift from anger to panic. The divorce papers will be ready soon. And trust me, with all the evidence I have, you're not getting a dime from me. Her face crumpled again, and she started to sob. What am I supposed to do? She whispered. That's not my problem, I said coldly. I left the room and went into the guest bedroom, slamming the door behind me. I didn't want to hear her cries or her excuses anymore. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling and feeling the weight of everything crashing down on me. Our marriage was over. The life I thought we'd been building together had been nothing but a lie. But for the first time in months, I felt a small sense of freedom. The next morning, Sarah was gone. She left a note on the kitchen table, scrawled in messy handwriting. I'm sorry. I don't know what else to say. I'm staying at my mom's for now. Please don't tell her everything. I don't want to hurt her. I'll wait to hear from your lawyer. I crumpled the note and tossed it in the trash. When Sarah left, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief, anger, and a hollow kind of sadness. The house was eerily quiet without her, but I welcomed the silence. For the first time in weeks, I didn't have to pretend everything was fine. But her departure didn't mean the fallout was over. In many ways, it was just beginning. The first thing I did was lock down our finances. My lawyer had already advised me to separate my assets, so I moved all but a small amount out of our joint account into one under my name. I canceled the credit cards she had access to and flagged any suspicious transactions for further investigation. Felt petty, but I didn't care. She'd spent months siphoning money from me to fund her affair, and I wasn't about to let her take another dime. A few days later, I got a call from her mom. Hi, sweetheart, Carol said, her voice warm but concerned. I just wanted to check in. Sarah's been staying here for a few days, but she hasn't said much about what's going on. Did you two have a fight? I hesitated, unsure how much to tell her. Carol was a kind woman, and I didn't want to drag her into the mess Sarah had created. But at the same time, I couldn't bring myself to lie. It's a little more complicated than that, I said carefully. She sighed. I figured. She seems different lately, distracted. I just wish she'd talk to me. I didn't respond, unsure of what to say. If you need to talk, you know I'm always here, Carol added. I just hope you two can work things out. You've always been so good together. Her words felt like a punch to the gut. I thanked her and ended the call, feeling a fresh wave of anger towards Sarah. Not only had she lied to me, but she'd also lied to her mom, using her as a convenient excuse to cover her tracks. Meanwhile, Sarah had started reaching out. It began with texts, short, apologetic messages that I didn't bother responding to. I'm so sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. Can we please talk? I made a mistake. I know you're angry, but I'm begging you to give me another chance. When I ignored her texts, she started calling. I let every call go to voicemail, but the sound of her voice, pleading, crying, was hard to ignore. One message stood out. "I've been thinking about everything you said," she said, her voice trembling. "And you're right. I messed up. I was selfish and I took you for granted. But Jake isn't who I thought he was. He's not what I want. I want us. Please, just call me back." Hearing his name made my blood boil. I deleted the message without a second thought. A week later, I ran into Jake. I was picking up some supplies for work when I spotted him in the parking lot of a hardware store. He was hard to miss. Broad shoulders, sunglasses, and that smug expression I'd come to associate with him. Part of me wanted to ignore him, but another part, the angry, wounded part, couldn't let it go. I walked up to him, my fists clenched at my sides. "Jake!" He turned, surprised to see me. For a moment he looked nervous, but then he smirked. "Hey, didn't expect to see you here." I took a step closer, my voice low and firm. "You didn't expect to see me? What? Did you think you'd just screw around with my wife and get away with it?" He held up his hands defensively. "Whoa, man. Look, I didn't know she was married at first, okay? She told me you two were separated." I laughed bitterly. "Separated? While we were living together, sharing a bed, and I was working 2 jobs to support her." "Sure." He shrugged. "That's what she said. I figured it was none of my business." "None of your business?" I snapped. "You knew she was married, and you still went along with it. That makes it your business." For a moment he looked uncomfortable, but then he smirked again. "Well, it's over now. She's not my problem anymore." That stopped me cold. "What do you mean?" He shrugged again. "She got clingy. Started talking about a future and how she was done with you for good. That's not what I signed up for. So I ended it." His words hit me like a slap. Sarah had thrown away everything. Our marriage, our plans, our life together. For a guy who didn't even care about her. I stared at him, disgusted. "You're both pathetic," I said before walking away. When I got home that evening, there was another message from Sarah waiting for me. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," she said, her voice thick with tears. "But I just want you to know how sorry I am. Jake's gone. He dumped me and I don't blame him. I ruined everything. I know you'll probably never want to talk to me again. But I just wanted you to know I'm staying with Mom. I won't bother you anymore." For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of something close to satisfaction. She was finally reaping what she'd sown. That night, I sat on the couch, staring at the divorce papers my lawyer had finalized. All I had to do was sign them, and it would all be over. And that's exactly what I did. After signing the divorce papers, I dropped them off at my lawyer's office the next morning. It felt surreal, like I was closing a chapter of my life I hadn't planned on ending. But at the same time, there was a sense of relief, like I was finally cutting myself loose from the weight of her lies. The process moved quickly after that. Thanks to the overwhelming evidence I'd gathered, Sarah didn't have much room to argue. My lawyer had ensured that she wouldn't walk away with any of my assets or savings. Her infidelity, paired with her misuse of our joint finances, had sealed the deal in my favor. A few weeks later, I got a text from Sarah. "Can we talk? Just once, before everything's finalized." I stared at the message for a while, debating whether to respond. A big part of me wanted to ignore it and let the silence speak for itself. But another part of me felt like I needed closure. Not for her sake, but for mine. I agreed to meet her at a neutral spot, a small park near her mom's house. When I arrived, she was already there, sitting on a bench under a tree. She looked different. Tired, worn down. Her usual confidence was gone, replaced by something that resembled regret. "Thanks for meeting me," she said quietly as I sat down beside her. "What do you want, Sarah?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. She hesitated, wringing her hands. I wanted to apologize. For everything. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I couldn't let this end without saying I'm sorry." I nodded slowly. "Okay. You're sorry. Is that it?" Her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, I almost felt bad for her. Almost. "I don't know what I was thinking," she said, her voice breaking. Jake was exciting and fun, and I don't know what I thought, but it wasn't worth it. I ruined everything, and now I've lost you, him, everything we had. You're right, I said flatly. You did ruin everything. She flinched, like she hadn't expected me to agree so bluntly. Do you even realize what you've done? I continued. You didn't just cheat on me. You lied to me. You used me. I worked 2 jobs to support us, and you took that money and spent it on another man. Do you have any idea how that feels? She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I know I hurt you, and I'll never forgive myself for it. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I don't hate you, Sarah, I said finally, but I can't forgive you either, and I can't have you in my life anymore. She nodded again, wiping her eyes. I understand. The divorce was finalized a few weeks later. True to my lawyer's word, Sarah didn't get a cent. I heard through the grapevine that she was still living with her mom, struggling to find her footing. She'd applied for a few jobs but hadn't had much luck. Jake was long gone, and as far as I knew, she didn't have anyone else to turn to. Part of me wanted to feel bad for her. After all, we'd spent 6 years together. But every time I thought about it, I reminded myself that she'd made her choices, and now she was living with the consequences. As for me, life slowly started to get better. I quit my second job, finally allowing myself to have evenings and weekends free again. I started spending more time with friends, reconnecting with people I'd drifted away from during my marriage. First, it was hard. The weight of what had happened lingered, and there were nights when I lay awake, wondering how things had gone so wrong. But with time, the pain began to fade. One day, I ran into Carol at the grocery store. She looked frighlier than I remembered, but her smile was just as warm. It's good to see you, she said, giving me a hug. How are you doing? I'm okay, I said honestly. Getting by. She nodded, her expression softening. I just wanted to say I'm sorry for everything. I know Sarah hurt you, and if I'd known what was going on, I would have stepped in. It's not your fault, I said. You're a good person, Carol. None of this was on you. She smiled sadly. You've always been too kind. I hope you find someone who deserves you. Thanks, I said, feeling a lump in my throat. I hope Sarah figures things out too. Carol gave me a look, like she wanted to say more, but she held back. Take care of yourself, sweetheart, she said before walking away. That conversation stayed with me. It was the first time I realized I wasn't angry anymore. Hurt, yes, but the anger was gone. I'd survived the worst of it, and now, for the first time in a long time, I felt free. The months following the divorce were a strange mix of healing and rediscovery. For so long, my life had revolved around Sarah. Our marriage, my 2 jobs, and the future I thought we were building together. Now, all of that was gone, and I was left figuring out who I was without her. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. I started small, focusing on the things I'd let slip during my marriage. I joined a gym not to become a bodybuilder like Jake, but to take care of myself for a change. It felt good to channel my emotions into something productive, to see progress every week. I also started cooking for myself again. During the marriage, Sarah had done most of the cooking, but now it was just me. I turned it into a hobby, trying out new recipes and experimenting in the kitchen. Some meals were disasters, but others were surprisingly good. In those quiet moments, standing at the stove or chopping vegetables, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in years. Socially, I began to reconnect with friends I hadn't seen in ages. One night, a buddy of mine invited me out for drinks. It felt strange at first, sitting in a noisy bar surrounded by laughter and conversation, but it was exactly what I needed. You seem lighter, my friend said after a couple of beers. Like you finally got rid of something weighing you down. I laughed, nodding. That's one way to put it. By the end of the night, I realized he was right. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was carrying the world on my shoulders. Every now and then, I'd hear bits and pieces about Sarah. A mutual acquaintance mentioned that she was still living with her mom and working part-time at a retail job. Apparently, She'd been trying to patch things up with friends she'd neglected during her affair, but most of them weren't interested. "She's a mess," the acquaintance said. "Honestly, I don't think she's figured out how much she messed up." I nodded but didn't say much. Sarah's life wasn't my concern anymore. One day, I received an unexpected text from her. "Hi, I know I said I wouldn't bother you again, but I just wanted to say thank you for everything you did for me. I know I didn't appreciate it when I should have, and I'll always regret what I did to you. I hope you're doing well." I stared at the message for a long time. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to delete it and move on. But another part of me, one that was finally at peace, felt like I needed to respond. "Thanks for saying that," I replied simply. "I hope you're doing well too." It wasn't much, but it felt like closure. As the weeks turned into months, my life continued to change. I picked up new hobbies, started traveling more, and even began dating again. I wasn't looking for anything serious, but it felt good to put myself out there, to realize there was life after Sarah. One evening, as I sat on my porch watching the sunset, I thought about everything I'd been through. The betrayal, the heartbreak, the anger. It had all seemed so overwhelming at the time. But now it felt like a distant memory. For the first time, I wasn't defined by what had happened to me. I was just me, and that was enough. By the time a year had passed since the divorce, my life was in a completely different place. It hadn't been easy, but I had started to rebuild one day at a time. Looking back, I realized how much I had learned, not just about Sarah or our relationship, but about myself. The betrayal had been devastating, but it had also been a wake-up call. One of the biggest lessons I'd learned was to trust my instincts. When Sarah first started acting strangely, dressing up, hiding her phone and making excuses, I had pushed my doubts aside. I wanted to believe the best about her, even when the signs were glaringly obvious. I thought back to all the little moments when my gut had told me something wasn't right. If I'd trusted myself sooner, maybe I could have confronted the situation before it spiraled so far out of control. But I didn't blame myself anymore. I realized that my desire to see the best in her wasn't a flaw. It was a sign of how much I'd loved her. I also learned the importance of boundaries and self-respect. For too long, I had put Sarah's needs and wants ahead of my own. I'd worked 2 jobs, sacrificed my free time, and handed over money without question. All because I believed it was my responsibility as a husband. But a healthy relationship wasn't about one person giving and the other taking. It was about balance, mutual respect, and partnership. I vowed that if I ever found myself in another relationship, I wouldn't make the same mistakes. I wouldn't lose myself in trying to make someone else happy. Another realization came when I thought about Sarah's apology. Her text had been heartfelt, and I believed she genuinely regretted what she'd done. But regret wasn't enough to undo the damage. Trust was fragile, and once it was broken, it was almost impossible to put the pieces back together. I'd learned that forgiveness didn't have to mean reconciliation. I could forgive Sarah for what she'd done without ever letting her back into my life. And that forgiveness wasn't for her, it was for me. Holding on to anger and resentment would only hurt me in the long run. One night, as I sat in my living room, I found myself thinking about the life I'd built with Sarah. The good times, the laughter, and the plans we'd made for the future. There was a time when losing that life felt like the end of the world. But now I saw it for what it really was. A chapter in my story. It wasn't the whole story. I still had so much ahead of me. So many opportunities to grow, to explore, to find joy again. For the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful. As the months continued to pass, I began to see my life as a blank slate. For so long, my time, energy, and focus had been wrapped up in Sarah and the life we'd built, or rather, the life I thought we'd built. But now, I had the chance to figure out what I wanted. First, it was small things. I started taking weekend trips to places I'd always talked about visiting but never got around to. A quiet mountain cabin, a lively beach town, even just a few days in a nearby city to explore museums and try new food. Each trip felt like a step forward, like I was reclaiming pieces of myself that had been buried under years of sacrifice and routine. One of the biggest surprises came when I reconnected with an old friend. Her name was Mia, and we'd gone to college together. We'd fallen out of touch over the years, but one day, I saw her name pop up on a social media app. She'd posted a photo of a painting she'd done, a beautiful, abstract piece full of vivid colors. I left a simple comment, "Incredible work." A few hours later, she replied, "Thanks, it's been forever. How have you been?" What started as a casual online conversation quickly turned into something deeper. We talked about our lives, our careers, and how much had changed since the days when we used to cram for finals in the campus library. Eventually, Mia suggested we meet up for coffee. I was nervous at first, but seeing her again felt like slipping into an old, comfortable rhythm. Mia was kind and funny, with an easy laugh that put me at ease. She'd been through her own share of challenges, including a messy breakup a couple of years earlier, and we bonded over our shared experiences. "I guess we've both learned a lot about what we don't want in a relationship," she said with a wry smile. "Yeah," I replied, "but maybe that means we're finally figuring out what we do want." It wasn't a date, not officially anyway, but it felt like a turning point. For the first time, I saw the possibility of something new. Over the weeks that followed, Mia and I kept in touch. We met up a few more times, always under the guise of friendship, but there was something undeniably warm and genuine between us. She wasn't a replacement for Sarah. She wasn't a rebound or a quick distraction. She was just herself, and that was more than enough. Outside of my budding friendship with Mia, I also focused on my career. With the extra time and energy I'd regained after quitting my second job, I started taking on more responsibilities at work. My boss noticed my efforts and offered me a promotion, a step up in both pay and position. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was on solid ground. One evening, I found myself reflecting on how far I'd come. A year earlier, I'd been working myself to exhaustion, pouring everything I had into a marriage that was already falling apart. I'd been blind to the cracks, convinced that hard work and love were enough to hold it all together. Now I was standing on the other side of it. Life wasn't perfect, but it was mine. As I watched the sunset from my porch that night, I thought about Sarah, not with anger or bitterness, but with a sense of finality. I hoped she'd find her own way, just as I was finding mine. But whatever happened to her, it wasn't my concern anymore. My future was ahead of me, and for the first time in years, I felt ready to embrace it. A little over a year after the divorce was finalized, I stood in my living room, sorting through some old boxes. They'd been tucked away in a corner of the closet, untouched since the day Sarah moved out. Inside were remnants of our life together, photos, mementos from trips we'd taken, and cards we'd exchanged on anniversaries and birthdays. For a long time, I hadn't been able to bring myself to look at any of it. The memories had felt too heavy, too painful. But now, as I sifted through the box, I didn't feel sadness or anger. I felt nothing. The photos were just pictures. The cards were just words on paper. The life we'd shared had been real, but it was over, and I was okay with that. I set aside a few items that held sentimental value, not because of Sarah, but because of the moments they represented. A ticket stub from a concert I'd loved. A postcard from a place I'd always wanted to visit. The rest went into a bag to donate or toss. It felt good to let go of the past, to make space for whatever came next. That evening, I met Mia for dinner. We'd been seeing each other more often lately, and though we hadn't labeled our relationship, it was clear we both felt something strong. She made me laugh in a way I hadn't laughed in years, and being around her felt easy, natural. "You seem lighter," she said as we sat on the restaurant patio, sharing a bottle of wine. "Lighter?" I asked with a grin. She nodded. "Yeah, like you've finally let go of something heavy." I thought about her words, about the box I'd gone through earlier that day, and realized she was right. "I guess I have," I said. After dinner, we walked through the park, the air cool and crisp. The path was quiet, lined with trees whose leaves had just started to change colors. Mia slipped her hand into mine, and I felt a warmth spread through me. A warmth I hadn't felt in a long time. "Thanks for being patient with me," I said softly. She smiled up at me. "Thanks for letting me." As we sat on a bench overlooking the water, I realized how much my life had changed since that day I first suspected Sarah's betrayal. At the time, it had felt like my world was crumbling. I couldn't imagine life without her, and I couldn't see a way forward. But now, sitting beside Mia, I knew I'd found something even better. The betrayal hadn't broken me. It had freed me. Later that night, back at home, I took one last look at the bag of items from my old life with Sarah before taking it to the trash. It was the final step in closing the chapter, and as I shut the lid on the dumpster, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. The past was behind me. The future was wide open, and for the first time I felt ready to embrace it. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more dramatic and intriguing tales, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support means the world to me and helps bring more exciting content your way. Also, share your thoughts in the comments. What would you do in this situation? See you in the next story.